Welcome to the Governor's Conference, the South Dakota Governor's Conference Cattle Conference. I'm Darrell Cruey. I'm Secretary of the Department of Agriculture. It seems that if somebody is always doing these opinion polls around the state on politicians to see what they think, most of the results are fortunately rather predictable. The all too typical politician that we have out around says one thing and then does another. And the typical politician says one thing to somebody and then says something else to somebody else. Well, after a while we get a little bit confused when we do this. And it's no wonder, well, which politician that we happen to be talking to or about. When they do an opinion poll on William Janklow, the governor of South Dakota, they're really kind of rather strange when you get them coming back. Some people say they don't like him, and the rest of the people say they do like him. The people that don't like him say it's because he's outspoken. Got to watch that. He's opinionated, he's tough, he doesn't care for formalities, and he shoots from the hip. He's not afraid to take on a fight. And he's always trying to change things. Now, the people that do like him say that he's because he's outspoken, he's opinionated, he's tough, he doesn't care for formalities, he shoots from the hip, he's not afraid to take on a fight, and he's always trying to change things. Well, I guess we all know the guy that we're talking about. It's my privilege to introduce to you the governor of the state of South Dakota, the Honorable William J. Janklow.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And it's really nice to see all you folks here today. Some of you came great distances. What I'd like to do to start off are to introduce to all of you these guests that have come to South Dakota. One of our guest panelists and commentators, presenters, has not yet arrived, but the other ones are all here, and I'd like to have them all come in together as we all give them a nice South Dakota greeting. They're John Wild, who is president of the Cattle Council of Australia, Bill Heiferman, Dr. Bill Heiferman, who's a professor of rural psychology from the University of Missouri at Columbia, Kathleen Kelly, who's the vice president for the Rocky Mountain Farmers Union in Meeker, Colorado, Andy Goschak, who's a senior vice president and market analyst for LFG of Inglewood, Colorado, David Stroud, who's the senior vice president for Schaffner Communications from Chicago, and Mike Callicrate, who's the owner and operator of the Callicrate feedlot and also No Bull Enterprises from St. Francis, Kansas. Would you please welcome all of these gentlemen as they come in, and the lady. What I'd like to do is just set the stage a little bit for today. Today's not a formal day. This isn't intended to be a formal lecture day. What we'd like to have, and what we plan on having, are these presenters are going to make presentations. Then we're going to get them together as panelists, and we're going to open it up to questions from you ladies and gentlemen in the audience. These folks have come great distances, and I've assured them that South Dakotans, there is no place on earth that has less people that have more opinions than we do in South Dakota. If we took all the people in South Dakota and put them together in one city, we'd only be the 59th largest city in America. There are 58 cities in this country that have more people in them than the whole state of South Dakota. Yet on the other hand, as somebody said to me one time when I was visiting with them and they took a position, and then an hour later they took a different position, I said, wait a minute, you've just taken two positions. He said, you have to understand, Janklow, in South Dakota, 3 people, 5 opinions. And that really puts us and our people in perspective. But at the same time, we're courteous, we're friendly, we treat people whether we agree or disagree with them with generosity, and we welcome them as our friends. I've got a couple slides that I'd like to throw up onto the screen that I think put some of this into perspective for today. If we could get them to throw those slides up. This is the instant communication era that we're in. This first slide shows the average steer prices for a fed steer. It goes back to the 1975 era through 95. I didn't have the statistics through 96, and obviously over the course of the last year, there's been a phenomenal difference. But through 1975 to 1995, you can see the trend in the fed steer prices. The next chart that we have that we're going to throw up, this is a very telling chart. We all have opinions on exports and imports, and it invokes a great deal of comment among especially livestock producers, more so than grain producers. But you can see on the blue line up there, again, the trend line from 75 through 95, the imports. And for all practical purposes, they've stayed within a relatively narrow band over a very substantial period of time, about a 20-year stretch. On the other hand, you can see a very substantial, continuous increase in the amount of exports that we in America have had for our red meat, especially particularly with beef. What this tells us is that in terms of short-term dislocations, you can have a great deal or a great number of problems, but it also tells us that in a real world, the trends are headed in the right direction. Albeit, forget the blue line has dipped down a little bit, just assume a relatively constant band that it's moving in. It tells us that for America's perspective, the export picture is moving in the right direction. Whether or not it's fast enough, whether or not it's the right thing to do is a whole different question. But I think to set the stage mark for the presentations today, we have to put these kinds of things in perspective. The next chart that we have shows you red meat per capita consumption in America. This is an incredibly important chart if you believe at all in any of the precepts that deal with the supply and demand equations or supply and demand economics. Because what it tells us is America peaked out on its per capita red meat consumption 20 years ago, and that for all practical purposes, there's been a slow, continuous erosion in the amount of red meat per capita that Americans have consumed. Now, that frankly doesn't surprise anybody, given what a lot of the Jane Fondas have had to say and a lot of what other people have had to say, giving the changing attitudes in America, whether we like it or don't like it. Setting the stage again is important to understand the reality that this is not an increasing market over the long term in terms of per capita individual consumption. In fact, we're dealing with a decline curve with respect to the individual ingestion of meat. The next chart that we have shows us the cattle herd inventory. And what it tells us, way back in 1982, we had about 115 million head of cattle in our herd. We're now down to someplace around 104, 105 million, and I'm just extrapolating from the blue lines on the chart. But what it tells you is there's been a tremendous swing over 20 years in the amount of inventory of the total amount of what I'll call the crop of cattle that we've had within our inventory in the United States, and that since about 1989, there's been a continuous increase, albeit slow, but a continuous increase in the amount of total supply. The next chart that we have deals with the retail price survey. I thought this was important to throw up because, again, it puts into perspective if there's something that hasn't been constant, if there's something that hasn't leveled off, And if there's something that, again, in a trend line has been a continuous increase over time, it's the retail price survey of 5 to 6 specialized cuts based on an annualized basis. Again, starting at about $1.52 in 1975, 20 years later, for all practical purposes, doubling. It's the only thing in the livestock industry that's doubled, other than taxes and inputs, over that period of time. But again, it tells us something that we have to begin to understand if we're going to make sense out of all this predicament that we find ourselves in every few years. The next chart that we have, well, we had one more chart I wanted to put up. It dealt with the different amounts of consumption that we had, dealing with poultry versus fish versus red meat, and compared all three of them on one chart. Unfortunately, I don't have that chart here, but it really tells a powerful story, because what it tells us is poultry's eating our lunch, if you're in the red meat business. That notwithstanding the decline, the long, slow, continuous decline in the consumption of red meat, there's been a corresponding increase. Here's the chart right here. If the red meat represents the red line on the top, you previously saw that chart. The next one, the dark line represents, the top line is total red meat. The next one is the beef line. Poultry is the blue line, and fish is the bottom line that's in green on the chart. For all practical purposes, fish has been relatively constant. Seafood has been relatively constant. But what you can see is a tremendous change has taken place statistically between what I'll call the red meat or the beef industry and the poultry industry. So it isn't that people are not eating meat. It's the kind of meat, if we can call poultry a meat, it's the kind of meat that they're eating that's having a very dramatic difference. It's the only way I can get the statistics to go up on beef is to throw poultry in with it. But the bottom line is this again tells us a very important story in terms of perspective of where we're at, and it sets the stage for where we have to go. Thank you for putting those charts up. You know, some people say, how much does a cow weigh? And if you ask me a question like that, I tell you I don't know. If you ask me again, I say I really don't know. If you ask me again, I say I honestly don't know. Because I need more information to tell you how much a cow weighs. The same is true when we're dealing with an awful lot of things that deal in the livestock industry. We don't always know the answers to questions. We may have opinions, but we don't know the answer to questions until we get the facts. What we've tried to assemble here today are some of the best spokespersons. And frankly, we reached out to every group representing the various interests in South Dakota that we get to. This idea, frankly, first came to me when somebody mailed to me a copy of a speech that Mr. Wild from Australia had made elsewhere in America. As I read that speech, and some cattle producer sent it to me it was a call to arms for America on where we were at vis-a-vis the rest of the world, and how are we going to deal with it. Some of us can say we need to go back to Fortress America, that we need to put barricades around ourselves and fend off the world. Others say our problem is that we haven't opened up the gates for others as wide as we've opened up our gates. And then you've got all kinds of combinations of attitude and feelings in between. One country's idea of a subsidy is another country's idea of self-preservation in the food business for the ability to feed one's own population. And you can think of a million different arguments that different countries or different interests want to make to defend the positions that they've taken. But the reality of the situation is, a country, we think we're a huge producer in red meat, but Australia produces and exports more red meat in a year than we do. That's an important perspective, because in certain respects there are friends in bringing down barriers, but in other respects they're an incredible competitor of ours on world markets. But we've tried to bring together today people that are involved in beef promotion, people that are involved in processing, and people that are involved in consumption. So in a short period of a time of a day, we could try and bring ourselves some new information and new perspectives on all three of these facets. I don't need to stand here today as an elected official and tell you that the cattle industry is incredibly important to South Dakota. In this little old state of less than 1 million people, it's a multi-billion-dollar industry. And if you look at the course of South Dakota over the last 12 to 14 months, absent the natural disasters that we've had from too much moisture in certain areas of the state, and the winter storms, which we always get in different places, that have caused devastating losses to our people in localized areas, it's the cattle industry that's been the economic drag overall on the economy of South Dakota. And if it's been a drag overall on the state's economy, imagine what it's like in localized communities and with individual producers. It's an immense drag, something that for all practical purposes can drag them into non-existence in a relatively short period of time. But in human terms, it's really an awful lot of our lifeblood in South Dakota. It's where we get the resources that bring strength to families and community schools and churches and communities. And if you go back in history in South Dakota, it was the Scandinavians that first brought small herds of cattle to southeast South Dakota. But the real cattle industry has come on what they call the Empire of Grass, that starts just a little bit east of here and goes all the way to the Montana and the Wyoming borders. You look back in history and we have names of people like Paul Narcell and his sons Edwards and Narcisse, Basil Claymore, Murdo McKenzie, Ed Lemon, Harry Ulrichs, Luther John and A.C. Van Meter, Peter Dupree, Scotty Phillip. And legends like that have left an incredible imprint on South Dakota. Just reading those names tell you where a lot of our communities in western South Dakota got their names and the kind of impact that those people had. There was a time when Bill Janklow got into the cattle business, believe it or not. Back after I left office, I went to Marvis Hogan and I bought 3 Texas Longhorns from out by Kadoka. I put them on my 40 acres down by Murdo. Those 3 never understood the ground rules. The fences were to keep them in. I had the damnedest problem anybody's ever seen, because my 3 cows and the calf that I got from Marvis thought that they were still West River on all that rangeland of his. And so they not only used my property, but they used all the neighbors in the surrounding area, and we couldn't keep them in. And finally, I was down one day, there was a big rodeo at the arena in Sioux Falls, and my cattle were roaming all the neighborhoods. I was spending every week just writing checks to the neighbors on the damage they were doing as they roamed around the Brandon area. And the best thing I got were sightings at different times, but a bunch of cowboys were out there at the arena at a rodeo. And so they were all making fun of me that I couldn't get my cattle rounded up, so they showed up the next morning. The rodeo was in the afternoon and evening. They showed up early in the morning with all their trailers and pickup trucks and their horses, and they had a roundup. And they said, "You give us $200, we get your cows." I said, "You got $200, you get my cows." Well, they went off riding. It looked like a sheriff's posse as they took off, about 9 of them, and about 10 minutes later, here comes one of my cows loping across the prairie with the whole sheriff's posse chasing it. One guy actually got a rope on the cow. He tied it on his saddle horn, at which point that cow went sideways, dragged that horse over, and dragged that horse probably 40 yards before it broke. The saddle horn broke, and the cow ran away, and we thought it killed the horse. And that horse laid there for a while. It got up. It was really a mess. They all very quietly loaded back in their trailers and got the heck out of there. And so then all of a sudden I realized very, very quickly that cowboys couldn't do it. That God made big cowboys and God made little cowboys, but Remington made the difference. And so I went in the cattle slaughtering business. And the net result is I cured the problem for the neighborhood, and I got out of the cattle business. But I want to assure you all, whether they're high cattle price times or low cattle price times, I'm not a threat to the overproduction in America. I'm not a threat to anybody. Look, this conference today, it's not a rehearsed conference. We have not asked or pre-screened any of these speakers. What I've asked them to do, and as you can see from their resumes, which are written in the pamphlet, what you can see from their resumes is they represent a whole broad range of different interests. The folks that met with them last night came back, and some of them met with me late in the evening last night, and they said what's remarkable about them is how congenial, how friendly, how sociable they all are, and how fixed and firm each and every one of them is in the opinions that they have. But we didn't exercise any license or editorial control over today. We want them to come help inform us in South Dakota so we can make up our own collective minds as to the course and direction we have to take as a people, but frankly, more importantly, the course and direction that some of you have to take as individuals. I really want to thank each and every one of you presenters for coming here today. Bob Peterson from Iowa Beef Packers, Marshall just slipped me a note. Bob Peterson is here. He's going to be the first one to speak, and I'll just introduce him, and he can come in then. But let me tell you a couple things about this gentleman. They tell me that he never sits down to write a speech. His staff usually tells him when he's preparing to make a speech that what he says may not be well received, but he just keeps preparing anyhow. On the issue of federal meat inspection, I've never met anybody who's more passionate. And I've had several meetings with this gentleman. I've had dinner with him a few times. He's one of the more engaging, enlightening people that I've had the privilege of meeting or talking to. But he's a passionate believer that the playing field is not level in terms of how meat is treated in America when it comes to processing and when it comes to inspection. He says that he feels that cattle producers and the livestock industry have failed to answer the bell when it comes to dealing with the federal government that's stealing money out of the pockets of beef producers. He once told an audience in a speech, "I hate whiners, I hate thumbsuckers, and I hate tree huggers." He believes in the old proverb that says, "My friends talk to my face, my enemies talk to my back." He's come here today to visit with us face to face. But in my conversations with him, I also reminded him of something that I read that he'd said in an article in the Omaha World Herald one day, where he said, "My business, notwithstanding all the strong attitudes that people have on all sides of the equation, my business, Bill, cannot survive without the cattle feeder. We need a viable cattle feeding industry in America in order for my business to survive." This is a gentleman who took you could say, a nondescript business or corporation, if you'll have that, and turned it into a true food empire, a mega billion-dollar company, one of the largest companies in America. He's got strong opinions. He's very bright. He's very resourceful. And he's willing to come share some of his time with us here today to talk to us about what does the future look like for the cattle business to IBP, and suggestions as to where we ought to go, or where you ought to go and he ought to go, where ought the producers to go, and at the same time the processors, in order to provide the maximum amount of financial reward to all. So our first presenter today is Mr. Bob Peterson, the Chairman and the Chief Executive Officer of Iowa Beef Packers. Bob, come on up, would you please? He's right over there.